The Soviet T-34 was not just another tank on the Eastern Front. It was the machine that broke the back of the German Blitzkrieg, the iron beast that rolled through mud, snow, fire, and artillery without stopping. And the secret behind its unstoppable reputation wasn't just the sloped armor, the gun, or the engine. It was the tracks. Tracks so rugged, so strangely simple, and so brutally efficient that every army in the world, including the United States, tried to copy them. But when America built its own versions, something was missing. One small detail, one link, one engineering choice that Russia got right and the West didn't. To understand why, you have to return to the winter of 1941, when the first ruined German tanks were found frozen in fields outside Moscow. Their engines stalled, their transmissions cracked, their crews half buried in the snow. And next to them sat the T-34, still warm, still running, still moving. American observers sent to the Soviet Union were stunned. They weren't just impressed by the tank's armor or its speed, they were confused by how its tracks tore through terrain like it wasn't even there. Snow, mud, shattered forests, it didn't matter. Where Western tanks bogged and spun, the T-34 crushed forward. The Americans wanted to know why. At first glance, the answer seemed obvious. Wide tracks, big surface area, aggressive cleats. But that wasn't the real secret. American engineers copied all of those things during early testing for new tank programs, and yet their prototypes still got stuck where T-34s glided through. The problem wasn't the width, it wasn't the pattern, it wasn't the material. It was the hinge, the joint between each link of track. A hinge so unusual that American engineers didn't grasp what made it special until late in the war. The T-34 used a loose-pin track system, simple, crude, almost agricultural in appearance. The links were allowed to rattle, wobble, shift, and flex far more than American doctrine would ever allow. To American designers, this looked like bad engineering. But it was genius. The looseness allowed the track to self-clean. Mud fell out, ice cracked away, snow never compacted inside the joints. With every rotation, the track shook itself clear, like a dog shaking off water. American tracks, by contrast, were too tight, too precise, too engineered. Mud packed into the joints until the links locked together. Ice froze between pins and refused to break loose, and once the track jammed, the tank was finished. The T-34's sloppy design was actually the perfect design. But there was one more thing, one detail, so small it was almost invisible unless you looked at the track from underneath. The raised center guide horn cavity, a hollow channel built inside each link, shaped specifically to bend snow outward as the tank rolled. This tiny cavity acted like a built-in ejector. Every rotation blasted mud and snow away from the track teeth, keeping the drive sprocket clear. This was the one link that made it unstoppable. Without that cavity, American track copies jammed over and over in muddy proving grounds. Engineers thickened the links, strengthened the pins, changed the steel alloy. Nothing worked, because it wasn't a strength problem. It was a geometry problem. The Soviets had discovered that the simplest curved hollow, barely the size of a fist, could save a tank from stalling in the deadliest battlefield terrain on Earth. And they didn't discover it in a laboratory. They discovered it in a tractor factory. The T-34's tracks were born from decades of Soviet agricultural machinery design. Russian engineers knew how to build machines that plowed through endless mud. American tank designers, they came from universities, not farms. The T-34 track wasn't a military invention. It was a farming invention, repurposed for war. And as the Red Army rolled west, mile after mile, village after village, continent after continent, the world finally understood. Precision was not always the key to power. Sometimes unstoppable machines weren't those crafted with perfection, but those built with purpose. Machines that favored reliability over refinement, brutality over beauty, simplicity over sophistication. The United States would eventually improve its own track systems, but the raw, rugged, self-clearing heart of the Soviet design, the rattling hinge and the hollow cavity, remained uniquely Russian. The thing America copied, and the thing America still never fully mastered.
American engineers spent years trying to understand why their track systems, even when widened and strengthened, continued to choke in the same muddy proving grounds where captured T-34s breezed through without complaint. Reports from Aberdeen Proving Ground described the same phenomenon again and again. American tracks packed solid with frozen clay, while Soviet tracks shed the same mud like water off metal feathers. By 1943, the United States had dissected multiple T-34s sent through Lend-Lease for evaluation. They ran metallurgy tests, stress tests, material fatigue simulations. They measured every bolt, every pin, every hinge, and yet the conclusion kept repeating. The Soviets didn't win through better steel, they won through better forgiveness. Their machines tolerated abuse the way their soldiers tolerated cold. Nothing needed to be perfect. Nothing needed to fit tightly. Nothing needed to be elegant. It only needed to work after weeks in the field without maintenance. And the track system embodied that philosophy more than any other part of the T-34. Meanwhile, American tank doctrine was still rooted in the belief that tighter tolerances meant superior engineering. Everything the US produced had to fit cleanly, lock strictly, and cycle smoothly. A track link was not supposed to rattle like a bucket of bolts. It was supposed to remain aligned, measured, predictable. But tanks do not live on factory floors. They live in mud. And mud does not respect precision. Every US attempt to tighten or refine the copied Soviet track designs only made the problem worse. Engineers added bushings, seals, improved lubrication channels, even new alloys designed to resist freezing. But every improvement created new points of failure. Soviet track pins could be hammered out with a rock. American track pins required tools, spares, and time. Soviet tracks could be repaired by exhausted infantry with frozen fingers. American tracks needed mechanics. Soviet tracks flexed, twisted, clattered, and screamed as the tank rolled. American tracks tried to stay perfectly aligned and tore themselves apart under pressure. It wasn't until the brutal Italian campaigns where American Shermans bogged in hillside mud that American crews began to understand the message Russia had learned decades earlier. You cannot engineer your way out of nature. You must adapt to it. Crews in Europe begged for field modifications that mimicked the T-34's looseness. Mechanics drilled holes into track links to shed mud. Some units crudely hammered dents into guide horns to break ice. Others tested Soviet-style duckbill extenders to widen the track and reduce ground pressure. But still, the one missing detail remained unnoticed. The hollow cavity inside the Soviet guide horn was easy to miss. It wasn't part of the link's profile.
It wasn't present on American casting diagrams. It wasn't mentioned in any Soviet documentation. It was simply there, carved into every link like a forgotten thumbprint. A small scoop, a soft curve, positioned at the perfect angle to pry snow outward with every rotation. American copies lacked this curvature. Their guide horns were either solid or sharply angled. They did not push snow in, they packed snow in. That was the difference. Not the width, not the strength, not the material. The curve. Every time a T-34 rolled, that curve acted like a self-cleaning shovel, ejecting the battlefield from beneath the tank before it could freeze solid. It was the smallest detail on the entire machine, but it kept the entire machine alive. In late 1944, an American report finally mentioned it, almost as an afterthought. Hidden in a paragraph buried in an appendix was one line. The Soviet guide horn cavity appears to reduce material accumulation during sustained movement. That was it. One sentence, one observation, the answer to years of field failures. And yet, by the time this tiny engineering truth was understood, the war was already turning. American production lines were set. Tank factories were operating at full speed. There was no time to redesign track modes, retool foundries, or pause shipments to Europe. The lesson had been learned, but far too late to change anything. Still, U.S. engineers kept the note, stored it, archived it, remembered it. Because they knew the Cold War was coming, and the next generation of tanks would not make the same mistakes.
When World War II ended, American engineers finally had the luxury of time. They returned to the T-34 with fresh eyes, no longer rushing to catch up, no longer racing to produce hundreds of tanks a day. Now they could study, measure, compare. The war had given them the lessons. Peacetime gave them the clarity. At Aberdeen, at Fort Knox, and later in the newly formed post-war testing centres, panels of engineers revisited the same Soviet features that had once baffled them. And the track system, the humble, clattering, mud-stained chain that propelled the T-34 across half a continent, became one of the most studied components in modern armoured history. For the first time, American metallurgists began analysing exactly how Soviet links endured such incredible punishment. They discovered the Soviets had intentionally allowed steel impurities that American factories avoided. These impurities made the links less brittle, more flexible, more willing to bend instead of snap. The Americans had tried to copy Soviet geometry, but the Soviets had built philosophy into steel. They weren't building machines to impress inspectors, they were building machines to survive Stalingrad. The more the Americans learned, the more they realized how different their approach had been. They had focused on craftsmanship. The Soviets had focused on endurance. They designed for the factory floor. The Soviets designed for a battlefield where factories could be bombed, workers could be starving, and machinery could be repaired with whatever tools still existed. It was in this environment that the famous guide horn cavity, the curved miracle detail, was finally mapped, photographed, and documented properly. Engineers measured its depth, its angle, its hollowed interior. They learned how it created a Venturi-like effect when the track rolled, sucking out packed snow and flinging it to the sides. The Americans ran tests under controlled conditions: frozen mud, wet clay, crushed rock, thawing spring slush. Time after time, the same result appeared. American track designs, even when widened and strengthened, accumulated mud after minutes of use. The T-34 tracks remained astonishingly clean. No matter how the Americans tried to optimize their tracks, the Soviet design still won. It wasn't graceful, it wasn't beautiful, but it was unstoppable. And now, the Americans finally understood why. But there was another revelation, one that had nothing to do with track links, pins, or cavities, one that shocked American testers even more. The T-34 didn't need to stay on its tracks. Its suspension allowed it to run on damaged, half-broken, even partially missing track sections. The Christie suspension, the same design Americans once dismissed as impractical, gave the tank enough flex to limp home even with catastrophic damage. American tanks built on stricter tolerances often immobilized with just a single broken link. To American observers, this was another example of inelegant genius. The Soviets didn't build for perfection. They built for failure. They assumed their tanks would be hit, damaged, pounded by artillery, driven by exhausted men, repaired in forests, in trenches, in barns. The T-34's tracks weren't designed to last forever. They were designed to last long enough. And in war, long enough wins battles. By the early 1950s, the United States began integrating many Soviet-inspired ideas into its next generation of armored vehicles. Field manuals emphasized the importance of self-cleaning track geometry. Designers rethought the rigidity of American hinge systems. Engineers experimented with flexible track pins and simplified link shapes. But even then, something was missing. The T-34's magic wasn't in one detail, it was in the combination. The curve that cleared snow, the loose hinge that shed mud, the flexible steel that absorbed shock, the wide profile that spread weight, the crude simplicity that made field repairs possible. The genius of the T-34 track system came from a worldview fundamentally unlike the American one. The Soviets built machines as if the world was falling apart. America built machines as if the world could be controlled. The battlefield decided which philosophy survived. By the time the United States fully implemented Soviet-style track adaptations, the Cold War was underway. New tanks rolled out with improved suspension, broader track shoes, more rugged joints. But even then, something was missing. The T-34's magic wasn't in one detail, it was in the combination. The curve that cleared snow, the loose hinge that shed mud, the flexible steel that absorbed shock, the wide profile that spread weight, the crude simplicity that made field repairs possible. The genius of the T-34 track system came from a worldview fundamentally unlike the American one. The Soviets built machines as if the world was falling apart. America built machines as if the world could be controlled. The battlefield decided which philosophy survived.
By the time the United States fully implemented Soviet-style track adaptations, the Cold War was underway. New tanks rolled out with improved suspension, broader track shoes, more rugged joints. But the one curve, the perfect hollow cavity that made the T-34 self-cleaning, remained unique to Soviet designs. It wasn't that America refused to copy it, it was that American engineers could never fully recreate it. Not because they lacked the intelligence, but because they lacked the Soviet context. Soviet design was born from desperation, American design was born from abundance, and abundance rarely produces brutal simplicity. By the late 1950s, the war was long over. But the T-34's legacy was only growing. From Korea to the Middle East, from Southeast Asia to Africa, nations across the world continued to drive Soviet-built tanks into battle.
And again, American observers found themselves confronting the same stubborn truth. The tracks were still performing better than anything the West fielded. In Korea, American tank crews watched, stunned, as T-34s climbed slopes that should have stopped any armored vehicle cold. Ice-packed hillsides, rock-choked inclines, gullies filled with half-frozen mud, none of it seemed to slow those wide, clattering tracks that slapped the ground like steel palms. And even when the North Korean crews were inexperienced, even when the tanks were poorly maintained, even when the vehicles were decades old, the tracks kept pulling. The same wasn't always true for American vehicles. US tank crews reported multiple immobilizations caused by frozen mud choking the drive sprockets. Some failures were minor, others catastrophic. A tank stuck in the open becomes nothing more than a steel coffin waiting to be cracked. But the T-34s? They just kept grinding forward. During the early Cold War, American analysts revisited every document, every photograph, every field report from World War II. They were looking for the why behind the phenomenon. And again, the same answer kept appearing. A simple curve carved into a track link was doing more than geometry should allow. In a classified report circulated among engineers, a line appeared that almost read like poetry. The cavity does not merely clear mud, it encourages the earth to leave. It wasn't just the shape, it was how the shape interacted with motion, how it leveraged momentum, how it changed the flow of soil. Soviet engineers, without high-speed cameras or advanced fluid models, had stumbled upon a principle that wouldn't be formally understood in the West for years. But even as America documented it, they still couldn't implement it, because implementing it required letting go of an engineering culture that prized precision above practicality. The T-34's secret wasn't one link. It was a system built on contradictions. Loose tolerances that increased durability, impure steel that increased flexibility, crude fabrication that made field repairs possible. America could study the result, but copying the philosophy was something else entirely. Throughout the 1960s, American armored doctrine shifted in small but significant ways. New design memos warned against creating tracks with overly tight tolerances. Manuals stressed the importance of mud-shedding geometries. Tank factories experimented with broader shoe patterns, flexible joints, and simplified shapes. They weren't copying the T-34 outright, but they were learning from it. Still, whenever American test crews ran comparative trials, the Soviet-style track always performed better in extreme conditions. Cold, wet, rocky, frozen, flooded. The harsher the terrain became, the more the Soviet design shined. Look at any Cold War battlefield. The Sinai, the Golan Heights, the jungles of Vietnam, the frozen hills of North Korea. And you'll see the same thing. If a T-34 was moving, the tracks were moving. If an American tank stopped, the tracks had stopped first. In the 1970s, as the US prepared its next-generation tank programs, a surprising question surfaced during internal design reviews. Should we simply adopt a Soviet-style track? It wasn't asked publicly, but behind closed doors, many engineers argued yes. The answer, however, was no. The reason? Pride, and politics, and doctrine, and the belief that American technology eventually must surpass Soviet improvisation.
So the US stuck with familiar principles. They improved their metallurgy, they expanded their track width, they strengthened their joints, but they never reproduced the curve. Not exactly, not intentionally, not with the same strange hollow profile that looked sloppy but functioned like genius. Even as late as the M1 Abrams, America used a fundamentally different philosophy: high precision, low tolerance, and a reliance on controlled manufacturing environments. The T-34? It could be built in a factory with no roof, by workers with frostbitten hands, in a city being shelled. Its track was born of hardship. America's tracks were born of industry. And hardship, terrible as it is, sometimes produces solutions industry cannot. Today, when military historians revisit the T-34, they almost always focus on the armor, the sloped hull, the Christie suspension, the diesel engine. Few mention the tracks. Almost none mention the cavity. Yet those tracks carried the Soviet Union from the gates of Moscow to the ruins of Berlin. They crossed rivers, plowed snow, clawed through forests, and dragged themselves over terrain that would break other vehicles entirely. The T-34 earned its legend through fire, but it survived its legend through steel. Not armor steel, not gun steel, but track steel. The part everyone ignored was the part that never stopped moving. And America tried to copy it. They got close, but they missed the one link, the one curve that made the T-34 unstoppable.